So recently, there's been a number of articles popping up from a variety of sources talking about how people have been getting burned out on super long games and that shorter games are the current trend as a result of that. And I thought that I might as well use this as an excuse to give my own quick 2 cents on the matter because frankly, I think that many of the people talking about this issue are kind of missing the forest for the trees. Now, sure, obviously everyone has their own preferences. Maybe you personally like shorter games more than longer games, or vice versa. But I don't think that the reason why so many people are calling for shorter games to get made right now is because of some kind of universal preference for shorter games or problem with longer games. It's because so many games these days, especially big budget AAA games, are just getting way too long for their own good. Now, that does sound like I'm kind of saying the same thing, but there's a very specific difference between a long game and a game that is too long. For example, Baldur's Gate 3 is brought up a lot in many of these articles as a counterpoint. That game won basically every Game of the Year award in existence and is universally acclaimed by virtually anyone with even a remote interest in the genre, and that is despite it being a 1 to 200 hour long RPG. Compare that to say, well, let's just pick a random game out of nowhere like Starfield. That game's main story is only like 20 to 25 hours long, at least according to How Long to Beat. Even if you complete all of the side quests in that game and try to do just about everything that you can that's worth playing, which is not a lot, chances are you'll play that game for less time than a single casual playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3. By most metrics that you can find, Baldur's Gate 3 is far longer than Starfield, and yet people are generally much kinder to Baldur's Gate than they have been to Starfield. Now, obviously that is just the one example, but I mean, I can easily bring up plenty of other examples of long games that have been given high praise like Monster Hunter, as much as I can think of long games that get dunked on constantly like Assassin's Creed, and just pick whatever entry you want. I mean, hell, I don't even have to use big epic single player games like Baldur's Gate to make my point here. In fact, I think a much stronger point to make would be to remind everyone that multiplayer games exist too. Like, are these people really going to tell me that the issue is that players don't want to spend hundreds of hours playing a single video game these days when some of the most popular games in the world right now are games like Fortnite or Helldivers or MMOs like Final Fantasy XIV, or just whatever your personal favorite multiplayer game is? People casually sink hundreds, if not thousands of hours into these games without even giving it a second thought, and I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon. Hell, Deadlock isn't even technically out yet, and I've already logged 200 hours into that game personally. So yeah, just to be absolutely clear, I don't think the issue has ever been just how long a game is. Rather, the problem is that so many big budget games seem to have this impression that they need to have a certain amount of content, and they will do everything in their power to reach that amount, regardless of how much actual real content they really have. And that results in them employing a number of ways to just pad out their game's runtime with lesser content to make it seem bigger and more worthwhile than it really is. I mean, take something like the Horizon games. I personally enjoy Horizon Zero Dawn, and I'm currently playing through Forbidden West. By all means, I don't think that they're bad games. However, when I play these games, I'm playing them for the fun robot dinosaur combat. I'm playing them to uncover the lore of the ancient world and the secrets of what led to humanity's downfall and stuff like that. And to be frank, I'm not playing these games to learn about the random goings-ons and politics of various tribes people. I'm not wholly uninterested in some of that stuff. Like, it is fun to see how the society has adapted to this kind of crazy schizo tech world where they simultaneously have spears and bows and also heavy machine guns looted from dinosaurs. But like, the vast majority of the game's side content is just nowhere near as interesting or engaging as the main gameplay or story. And I think a good counterexample to this sort of thing is like Cyberpunk. That game has tons of side content, but Honestly, I think that for the most part, it almost feels like they've put nearly as much effort into their side quests as they do into their main quests. A lot of the content is just really well written with strong dialogue and characters and some interesting player choice options and whatnot. Like, I love how the random boxing side quest that you can get at the start of the game had each character that you fight kind of have their own unique gimmick and twist to the fight with their own reasons for fighting and stuff like that. And it even culminates in this big fun title bout against the champ with your coach giving you tips on strategy and whatnot. Like, that is just so fun despite it being such a minor random part of the game, especially when compared to how many other open world games handle that kind of content. But of course, there are a number of other techniques that these sorts of games are using to pad out their runtime that I think are much worse. For example, sometimes the game just doesn't really know what to focus on. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is famously bloated to hell and back. I remember watching a White Light's retrospective on the game relatively recently, and he mentioned how despite the game being dozens of hours long, so many characters felt like they were underdeveloped and just underbaked. He described it like the game had 16 different 3-hour long stories, as opposed to a more focused handful of much longer stories that could have had a lot more time to flesh out each character to tell a more compelling narrative. The game has tons of runtime. It's not like there wasn't room for them to do that and tell a longer, more coherent story, but it just doesn't use all of those hours effectively. It and many other games like it just tend to spread themselves too many directions at once, whether we're talking about just writing problems or things like implementing too many different kinds of mechanics in the same game. So despite having potentially hundreds of hours of content, none of that content ends up being nearly as fleshed out as it should be. This sort of thing is the exact reason why Breath of the Wild felt like such a breath of fresh air back in 2017, because unlike so many other giant open world games both before and after it, it felt a lot more focused in its design. They didn't bog down the game with complex skill trees and dialogue wheels and an over-the-top crafting system, or a big fancy magic system and all that extraneous stuff like so many other games of these sorts are just packed to the gills with. And the thing is that none of those mechanics that I mentioned are necessarily bad on their own. I love a good complex magic system or having a good conversation with an NPC, but when your game has all of those mechanics, it almost universally results in some, if not most of them, being underbaked. So instead, when they were making Breath of the Wild, they knew that they wanted to make a game that focused on that feeling of discovery from exploration, with some nice and simple combat and puzzle mechanics and a robust physics engine to give the player some creative freedom in how they solve their various problems. And so, the vast majority of the game focuses on just that stuff, and unsurprisingly, people for the most part loved it. Another great example of this sort of thing is Disco Elysium. That's another really long game that focuses almost exclusively on just having interesting conversations with NPCs, and as a result, that has some of the best dialogue and character writing and just overall quality that I've ever seen in a video game. Hell, probably some of the best writing, just period, full stop. And chances are that if they had wasted time trying to implement things like a combat system or character creation mechanics and whatnot, that they would have had to have taken away time from making the writing in the game as great as it was. Finally, there are games that are, to be frank, kind of faking how big they are to seemingly just meet a quota, and it's no wonder that people tend to turn foul on them. I already mentioned Starfield, but like, it's just such a good example of so many bad design trends. They kept touting how they supposedly have 1,000 planets worth of content, but the truth of the matter is that they don't even have one planet's worth of content. There's just a handful of different types of biomes and points of interest, and then they just randomly scatter those points across generic splotches of terrain and call it a day. And it's no wonder that the game feels padded to hell and back when I'm spending hours and hours of a playthrough just crossing huge blank empty spaces with no real content that weren't even crafted by a human. And again, procedural generation isn't even inherently bad. Tons of games have used it to great effect. Virtually all roguelikes roguelikes use this, like Splunky or FTL, and those come to mind because they use it in a way that always keeps the player on their toes. It stops them from just memorizing the layout of every level so that they're forced to get better at the game in other ways. Whereas the problem with games like Starfield is that they're using it as a replacement for actually coming up with a meaningful amount of content. Procedural generation is never going to be a good replacement for an actual handcrafted dungeon or a city with actual properly written out and designed content to explore, but naturally that's what games like Starfield use it for, just to pad out their runtime with meaningless content so that they can brag about it on stage. But yeah, like I said, I think the pattern here is pretty clear. The issue has never been that long games are problematic or that they inherently turn away players due to their length or something. Sure, like I said at the start, maybe you have a personal preference for shorter or longer games, and I won't deny that especially as people get older, they tend to have less time for gaming, so that can absolutely be a factor as well. But that has always been true for decades and hasn't suddenly changed recently. At the end of the day, what people are getting fed up with are games that pad out their runtime unnecessarily, as if to meet some pointless quota probably set by a clueless executive that doesn't know the first thing about game design. So yeah, I do ultimately agree that I think games should get shorter, but a lot of these people are arriving at the right answer with the wrong conclusion. I love me a Baldur's Gate or a Cyberpunk or a Monster Hunter or whatever, because those games actually use their runtimes to tell long and interesting stories or have fun and engaging gameplay that can actually last for all of that time. The real reason why games need to get shorter is because producers and directors and whatnot that don't actually know the first thing about game design need to stop arbitrarily stipulating that their games need to be this big for no reason. One last example that I think acts as a perfect microcosm of this issue before I close this video out for today is Balan Wonderworld. It was mentioned in interviews that the lead designer was like, I want 80 costumes in this game at the start of development, with seemingly no plan on how they would actually accomplish that. And they even went on to say that trying to make that many distinct costumes with unique abilities was a huge challenge for the developers, and it shows quite blatantly in the game itself with how many costumes are just completely worthless or just clearly duplicates of other costumes that were already in the game with different visuals, or they're just completely broken or only have a single one-time use or something. This is the real problem and the reason why games are too long and padded out. There was no reason why Balan had to have 80 different costumes. There was no reason why Starfield needed to have 1,000 different planets, and there's no reason why Assassin's Creed needed to have so many extraneous side quests and characters, and I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of these sorts of games would have greatly benefited from simply cutting out a lot of this content in the design phase and focusing on the good parts of the game that they did have. By all means, if you have the talent, skill, and resources to make a massive masterpiece like Baldur's Gate 3, and I know that a lot of these companies do, then by all means, I hope that more games of that caliber get made. But these companies that are simultaneously complaining that games are getting way too expensive to produce need to stop actively shooting themselves in the foot and ruining their own products with all of this unnecessary padding, which just makes the games worse while also driving up expenses. Games aren't too long, management just doesn't know how to do their goddamn job. And on that somewhat heated note, thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe and all that jazz, and I hope to see you all in the next one.